Okay, I'll call this meeting to order, and I thank you all for coming on this wild and blustery night. Does anyone have any disclosure of pecuniary interest to reveal at this time? Seeing none, we'll go on to number 3, the adoption of the previous minutes. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Moved by Anita, seconded by, oh God, I'm terrible with names. I know you're Ian. Seconded by Ian, that the minutes dated October 29th, 2024 of the Short-Term Rental Committee be adopted as circulated. Any questions on those minutes? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion? Okay, moving on to item number 4.1, short-term rental survey. It is for your information only. Does anyone have any comments on that? The counselors did see it quite some time ago and had a discussion. So I will let our newer members have comments first. Does anyone have any comments on what you saw in the survey? Yep.
I'll lead off then. I guess certainly appreciate staff putting together the division between the Lakeshore Community Area 3 and then combining the other everything east of Highway 21 and the second grouping. And if I may make just some comments as far as what I pulled out as far as some of the stats and so on.
So what I'm going to suggest is that we run this fairly informally because I forget counselors and staff's name who have signs in front of them. Okay. So I'm just going to point and let's just talk away, okay?
Fair enough. But it certainly, I think, validated some of the opinions that I had, assuming the Lakeshore community was going to have different perceptions of short-term rentals. With the split between Area 1 and 2 combined and Area 3 on its own, it actually divided the total number of responses almost 50-50. 56% were from Area 1 and 2, 44 from Area 3. And the first interesting thing that I noticed was that from Area 1 and 2, only 45% live in proximity to a short-term rental, compared to in the Lakeshore respondents, it was 81%. So clearly they were definitely engaged in this process. And similarly, as far as the percentage of those concerned, also greater concern from the Lakeshore community as opposed to those that were more inland. What was encouraging was that in both areas, although the inland areas were slightly higher percentage, the amount of economic benefit and whether it makes ACW an appealing destination, it was both were in the positive territory, in excess of 50%. Now, where everything diverged a little bit was the perception of, is there a negative impact from short-term rentals? As far as the inland areas, that percentage was 14% compared to 45% for the Lakeshore communities. Similarly, that trend carried forward a little bit as far as the percentage of those that had issues with short-term rentals. It was only 15% as far as the inland areas, while that number was 46% as far as the Lakeshore community. So clearly, again, I think emphasizing the divergence. The one thing that was also consistent, at least between the two areas, that both were in positive areas in excess of 50% as far as whether the community supported short-term rentals. So it was good to see that both the Lakeshore community was 62%, the inland areas was 82%. So there is support for having short-term rentals in our community. Now, the other thing that was actually quite consistent between the two areas was that should short-term rentals be regulated or licensed? In the inland areas, that percentage was 43%, while in the Lakeshore it was 55%. So there was at least consensus, I would say, that there should be some kind of regulation or licensing of short-term rentals. As far as the action as a result of whether it's regulation or licensing and so on, that was highlighted, I think, in the question 17 in the survey. And actually, the results kind of mirrored both communities in that regard. The two leading areas, and actually, I'll just, the percentages that are shown in the response to the survey were, I think, a little misleading because the percentages were calculated on the basis of total responses. Sorry, it's a total number of participants as opposed to the total number of responses received. Because if I'm correct, that respondents were asked to select whichever ones they felt were relevant to the question. So there, even though there were only for example, in the Lakeshore, we had 326 respondents in total, but to that particular question, what action should be taken, there were actually 524 responses. So if you use the number of responses and do the percentage calculations, interestingly enough, the leading one in both inland and Lakeshore was education is important. And inland, it was a 30% supporting that. Lakeshore was 28%, so very consistent. As far as the responses indicating that licensing or regulation is an issue to be considered, both were identical at 22%. And where they diverged a little bit was inland, the restricting or prohibiting short-term rentals. Inland, it was 16%. Lakeshore was higher. Makes sense, I guess, intuitively, because the number of issues that the Lakeshore experience was higher than inland, and that was 16 to 27. So I think that the education and the licensing piece do go kind of hand in hand, as far as if ultimately we are looking at some kind of regulation or bylaw, that the education piece is equally important as far as what decisions or what recommendations the committee makes. So anyway, thank you for the time.
Well, thank you for that very thorough breakdown. And I didn't even catch the respondents and the respondees was a different number when it came to percentages. So thank you for that. Does anyone have any other comments? Okay, we're happy with what we know now. Great, and great report to the staff. Moving on to the short-term rental 4.2 monitoring programs. And Florence has provided a report. Florence, do you have anything to say about that report?
As indicated, after reaching out, I did receive one response, but I think for the purposes of what you're looking to, for the foreseeable future in this committee, I think you've kind of got an answer of what you're looking for, and also around what the price point would be from just literally a software point of view.
So with one respondent in, is this the appropriate time then to talk about whether that should be tabled or perhaps put to council? Are we interested in this report, furthering this report for $5,000 and asking council for that? Is that the process here, Florence?
I think what might be appropriate, and this is just from an element of process, would probably to first look at some bylaws and some samples of other municipalities in terms of what they do. And then after you kind of have an understanding of where you see this committee going, if we have a draft bylaw in place that would have some elements in there that would require the services of a contract, at that point, it would probably be more appropriate to ask council for some support in that regard.
Further question, Madam Chair? Go ahead. So, very entertained by my position here. So as far as timing goes, if it's going to be a budget request, are we going to run into a wall or do we have time to follow the process that you just outlined?
I think the committee could ask council to earmark some funds for the purpose of implementing any recommendation from the committee, knowing full well that the committee will be bringing forward a recommendation come next year. So I think, giving staff direction to put, a dollar amount in the budget that would be considered by council would be fairly appropriate.
Further questions? So that budget amount could come, do we have time at the next meeting, or would that need to come forward today?
I'll just say that there was a lot of useful information in this report. I'm not sure that it could be beneficial enough, knowing the amount of rental that are out there right now, that it could assist the committee in formulating the licensing program. So I think there's no fear in delaying. The one question I did have is they had some different options for 24/7 complaint and online complaint portals, and I wonder if we could do some investigation into that. And ideally, if I was to look at this program, I'd like to see it to be as least impactful to the staff and the bylaw staff at ACW as possible. So I wonder if we could look into some of those different options and maybe break it down a little bit more, what those options entail.
Thanks for that. I've noticed Florence was typing that up. So the other question about can we delay it is, at this point, we only have one respondent, correct? So we may well get another quote. Could we do it in January still for the budget?
I think we could, actually, let Mark answer that one.
Yeah, I think that'll be fine. Our budget won't come to council probably till March, so the treasurer will be working diligently on the budget in February. So if we meet last week in January, I think that's doable.
Councillor Snowblin.
So, thanks, Madam Chair. I was looking at the monitoring companies that you put in your report, Florence, and I know that you reached out probably shortly after October the 29th, and you got one response back. Do you expect that you'll hear back from the other two, or is it a straight no? Or are there other companies? I'm asking a lot of questions, I know, but I know that there's some neighboring municipalities that have regulations in place. Did they use any of these monitoring companies?
They do. Admittedly, I was kind of surprised that I didn't hear back. Part of it is the ask was to get us some numbers in order to work with and what that quote would be to do that, and then kind of a baseline of services. So I think just the general nature of the inquiry also probably didn't foster the result that in the end we probably should have got. But I think if we were to proceed and we had a little bit more information as to what you would like the program to be, with that request, it would be a more formal request for proposal, and then you would have more detail so that on the other end of it, from their side, they see the value in a good response, I guess.
So as a follow-up then, I think the way the chair is wanting to maybe direct us is that maybe we should earmark some money in our budget to address this for the monitoring companies. But I think I'd be cautious about how much money to earmark, in that we've got one quote here for, was it $5,000? I'm a little hesitant to earmark $5,000 until, we hear back from other companies, because we could spend $5,000 on this company and think that we're getting a really great deal. But what if there's another company that offers one for $8,000 and it has maybe a little bit more intricacies to it that we find more useful to us? So I'd hate to, if we're going to look at earmarking for the budget, that we're not short-sighted at $5,000.
So I think to that end, I mean, there's still a little bit of time, as Mark indicated. We won't present the budget to council until March. So, we have until January, and I can do a little bit of follow-up as well. So if the committee would like me to do a little bit more follow-up, I can.
Okay, before we answer that question, Mary?
I guess one of the things that I had some concern about, I guess it's Rentalscape, is that it's an American company, and they don't have very much. They only have one I guess municipality that they're dealing with in Canada, and I also looked at or when I was noticing who they were looking at, or the like Airbnb or VRBO, there wasn't any Canadian or Ontario renters or agencies that I noted, and so I just wonder if there's anybody in Canada or in Ontario specifically, and I guess we'll find that out.
Florence?
I think without having done a research specific to
yeah.
that, it's the more reputable ones are US based.
Are they?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it sounds like, would we like to give staff direction to pursue a more formal quote from different companies? Yeah, Sean?
I agree with Councillor Snowball, and I think that there's some merit to trying to formulate what the regulation is going to look like, and then making sure that the service provider fits that regulation.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, what are we hoping to achieve by engaging somebody like this? Is it the ability to just track the number of short-term rentals that we have in the community? Are we looking at using it as a tool to monitor complaints and issues? What's the primary reason for considering it? And the reason I asked that question, because I picked this up from Florence's report, that currently there are only 88 active listings
Mm-hmm.
in the area. Spending $5,000 to monitor 88 doesn't seem like good bang for your buck.
So does this work as a suggestion? We talk about our bylaws now and in January, and if we find then that we feel we should go forward with a fairly specific ask, quoting anyway, you could do that in February and still have a number. Our committee wouldn't necessarily have to approve the number before we give a heads up to the staff that we might be asking that. Does that make sense? That we continue on this discussion, but maybe make a decision a little later in the process? Anita?
May I say something in relation to what Mike had just mentioned? So going back, how long ago? Maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, when the short-term rental issues started to surface shortly after COVID, it became evident to council members and to some of our people that live particularly on the lakeshore, is that the way that the complaint process is that it is a cost item for the township in terms of bylaw officers and OPP reports and that sort of thing. And I guess the overreaching and the overarching reason and raison d'etre for a lot of this is that my point of view is that if we could have a regulation in place, then we would, there'd be a cost to it, but it would be offset by any kind of licensing fees, so that hopefully it's revenue neutral, or at the very least, it's negotiable as far as, on the balance sheet for cost versus revenue, expense versus revenue. Because the way it is right now and the way that it is, the trajectory is on the complaints and on all of the long-term or short-term rentals that we are hearing from time and time again, it's not going to cost us any less in the future as we go along. It's going to continue to, or at least the trajectory seems to be, it's going to continue to cost the township, not just the township, but all the taxpayers in ACW. And that means from all areas of the township, from the Amish to industry and farmers, it's all costing us money. So I guess overarching, I don't know if that answers some of your questions or your comments, Mike, but that was my overarching vision on this.
Sean?
And I agree with everything that Councillor Snowball said, and I'd just add that any regulation that comes out, I would like to see that there's a measure for self-regulation, so that instead of reaching out to the township to regulate any unruly guests or any issue at the rental unit, that there's an internal framework that the operator of the short-term rental is responsible for resolving those. And then if obviously they couldn't resolve those issues, then the township would have to be involved.
Okay, great comments. Maybe we'll move along in the agenda and table this conversation until we know more about it, but we will revisit it. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Moving on to 4.3, as per the work plan, the committee will review the following relevant bylaws in relation to short-term rentals, and they are part of your agenda package. Florence, how do you suggest we move forward in talking about these?
Well, first of all, these three are the most prevalent bylaws that we have concerns with, largely because especially for the open air and the noise and sound bylaw, it is incredibly difficult to regulate, as you require, in order to, I guess, press any charges, you require a witness, and or someone who's watching the event happen at the time. And very few people either would be willing to do that, or the owner of the actual property is not there at the time either. And that's kind of a hand-in-hand issue. In terms of how to go through, I think, I think each, member maybe would have an opinion on how each bylaw, pertains to either the property that they work with themselves, or how they see that it would impact a short-term rental, and then move through it that way.
Okay, so with that being said, we're going to discuss the open air bylaw first. What we're looking at is what is currently in effect, and I'm sure you know, but it's a reminder that ACW is a complaint-driven bylaw. So it might be the bylaw, but unless someone complains about it, nothing happens, right? We only have a short-term bylaw officer, and I'm not sure how well he's used, but I think he'd be used more.
Yeah, so our bylaw enforcement officer is contracted for 16 hours a week. And, depending on the season, sometimes that's used up, sometimes it's not, depending on, seems to even out. But we've definitely we've definitely used that increase. It used to be 8, if I'm not mistaken, 8 hours, and now it's 16.
Nita?
Clarence, can you just refresh me? Does our bylaw officer, does he work solely for ACW, or does he work for other municipalities?
I believe he does work for other municipalities, so he does share his time. I know for us, he's dedicated certain days in the office that he's there. However, I'm not confirmed exactly where, but he does work for other municipalities.
I guess my point is that, when you, the reason I ask is that you can say that he has a part-time position with our municipality for 16 hours a week. But, if he has to split that time between other municipalities, I'm sure because of the size of Huron County, and I assume the municipalities are in Huron County, there might be additional challenges to monitoring his time and his effectiveness and his efficiency in answering and responding to complaints. Not any fault of his, just it's the nature of the area.
To that end, and just in terms of the contract, he's always been very open about being flexible with that contract. He's always expressed that he likes working with us, so.
Mark, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I don't think he's working for as many municipalities as he once was. Once we took him on board, I think he agreed to take away some or get rid of some of the ones that he was looking at and just kept the ones that he really wanted. I think he's only working for 3, including us, I think now, but I'm not 100% sure. But he got rid of some of the other ones. And I think he likes that he has flexible hours and he does come here and look after. Will he be here forever? No, just because he's probably thinking about retiring at some point in time in life, and we're going to have to take that next step. And it's interesting because I did receive an email from a company that outsources these type of things, and some other local municipalities that we're familiar with are already using those services. So there are companies out there that do that, and they would be on call, and that's the problem we struggle with. Not only short-term rentals, but other infractions that we have that occur on the weekend. We can't get someone to get out there on the weekend. A lot of these issues that we have here right now are happening on the weekend, and that's where it's hard for instance, a burning bylaw. If we're looking at the open air burning, if they're not allowed to be burning, we can't charge the landowner. We have to charge those who are renting it, and if you can't charge those who are renting unless you catch them in the act, and by that time they've gone home. So that was a long story, long answer. Sorry about that.
Thanks for the scintillating monologue. Yes.
To that end, part of the contract with our bylaw enforcement officer is that if there is if we know there's a circumstance happening, say there's parking issues at Zion Beach, You know, if we know about it and it's a long weekend coming up, we will say to him, can you head out there on Friday and Saturday and just see what's going on? Yes, he'll do that, but he's not a it's based on a planned visit. It's not necessarily right on call kind of thing.
Okay, thank you for the staff responses. If we look at the open air bylaw, we've all read it or pretended we have. We know what it says. Does anyone have any comments about it? Anita?
I would just ask staff, like, do you feel that, the challenges are on the open air bylaw? What you said, Florence, is a remark that by the time anybody can do anything about it, the guests have gone home. And would you say the majority of the open air infraction or open air fires infractions are from short-term rentals, or would you say it's 50-50? Or is that easy to disseminate?
I agree that they're hard to enforce, but I look to Florence whether she has any of those facts,
No.
whether they come from Lakeshore, whether they are short-term or just Lakeshore in general.
Off the top of my head, for the open air burning complaints we do get, most of it is for fires on the beach. Or fires that are, you know, in the backyards and they're happening all night long. That's kind of that kind of thing. And those are usually in conjunction with a noise complaint, that kind of thing. So it isn't just necessarily the fire. The fire becomes a problem when it's associated with the noise. It's when it's like an accumulation of the different aspects. Just from an enforcement element, our bylaws are always in place to set the rules of how things should be. Years past, and I think I've mentioned this before, bylaws are put in place. There's a complaint. The bylaw enforcement officer goes out to the owner, has a conversation with the owner who lives there generally all the time, and the problem goes away because they've had that. Now the bylaw enforcement officer goes out, says, you know, here's the issue. They say, okay. And then the next day it happens again. So there's just a general lack of interest in compliance in some of these things. So when you have bylaws that it's sometimes difficult because it's so abstract. A fire is very abstract, and without being able to have some solid evidence that it actually happened, it's very difficult to enforce. So I feel like through a licensing program, if the enforcement of that bylaw became something like a demerit point where there was you had a neighbor who complained and that would give you a strike on that particular list. And that was your open air, you'd have had that one, or the noise complaint. If the officer or whoever it is that is kind of looking at this issue can verify without a doubt, they could testify that happened, then that would be considered something that would be off their record, off of their license. I think that's where this needs to be tailored. I suspect that the committee at some point, may have some recommendations on adjusting some of these bylaws for council to better reflect the licensing portion of it. That's my comments for now.
I do have one question. When you look at it and it says under item I, no open burning area means all properties classed as settlement areas, natural environment, or classed as other. What would be classified as other in our municipality?
Any commercial land or any of that kind of thing. Mark's got it.
Yeah, excuse me, sir. The open air is, so it says just where are we here?
Aye.
Yeah, so settlement areas, so it's classified, so farmland isn't applicable to this, so that's where it is. So what they do is when you look at the official plan, there's a settlement area, and if it's in that settlement area, this will apply. Because council at the time said, no, we don't want any rules for farming. If I want to take out a bunch of fence line and burn the tree, the post, not the trees, but they can do so. So that's why we went settlement area, because the official plan kind of segregates that out, so.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. The question goes beyond that as the settlement area, and I'm assuming that would be also the lakeshore. Natural environment is self-explanatory, but classed as other, is that just any commercial land is classed as other because it's not settlement or agriculture? Or, if we're running around the township going, hey, who's doing that? Not that we do, right?
That's a very good question.
Thank you.
That-
Okay.
I think it's a catch-all for anything that's not agriculture and not settlement area. So I think that's what it is. It's literally a legal word in there that makes sure that we've got things covered.
Ian?
So as far as the fire and the noise bylaws, we've got no stats on whether it's short-term rentals or owners or families of kids of owners and that we're having complaints by.
Florence?
So since we started keeping track of whether complaints were related to short-term rentals or not, I could go back and I could prepare a report that has those answers to that. Or at least, you know, we had of the noise complaints, you know, of the 15 or 20 that we had this year, 8 of them were related to short-term rentals. Whether or not they were teenagers or whoever, we would have no way of knowing that. You know, we're kind of also, when the complaints come in, the only reason I'm pegging it as a short-term rental complaint is because the complainant has said, this is a short-term rental that's being rented out. So I don't have any other method of verification that it actually is a short-term rental.
If I'm gathering the gist of the conversation here, it sounds like enforcement is always going to be a challenge, not only in the open air burning, but the noise and sound bylaw as well. So if that's the consensus, then I really didn't have any problem with the way the bylaw was worded itself. I think the next step would be, how do we create a linkage between that bylaw and whatever licensing or regulations are being drafted, you know, for short-term rentals, so that they are aware that, yes, there is certain requirements or bylaws that affect open air burning, the noise and so on. And, you know, how do you create that linkage? And that then ties back to the point I made at the beginning of the meeting, that education seems to be a really important part of how we go forward with any type of process. And if we're going to be identifying short-term rental property owners, you know, how do we raise the visibility of these different bylaws so they understand the consequences, you know, not only as far as burning, but noise. And then, you know, as far as property standards, that was a very robust bylaw and it covers all kinds of different things. And, you know, is that one area? Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll come back to that one later, but.
Mark?
Back to what Ian's comment about, so we get monthly reports that go to council every month on bylaw enforcement officers. And in that report, it says how many noise, how many burning and sound, noise, property standards and burning. And the clerk will separate that out and then she'll put a little asterisk on the report saying, it's apparent that it may be a short-term rental, but not confirmed. So I think staff could probably easily pull out for the last 12 months just to get an idea of what alleged short-term rental complaints for those particular bylaws and bring that forward. And that would probably answer it. They're not confirmed, but alleged.
Are we interested in staff bringing that report to the next meeting then? Yep. Show of hands? Okay. Mr. McNeil?
Yeah, thank you very much. Florence touched on something, and one of the reasons we're here in society, I would suggest, we're seeing a diminished amount of respect being shown. And in the past, when a situation would occur and the bylaw officer would attend and have a conversation, the response would be that they would abide by it. And that has changed. And that's one of the reasons we're here.
Thank you, Glenn. So if everyone's okay with the open air bylaw, we'll move on to the property standards bylaw. And Mike, did you have something you wanted to say?
Dealing with specific issues that may impact not only the renter, but the owner of the property, as far as if certain property standards aren't met. And I'm looking at areas such as, and again, maybe my understanding as far as the building code as well probably ties into this, but you know, the requirements for smoke and CO2 detectors, the adequacy of septic systems, the appropriateness of decking, stairs, railings. If there's a pool on site, what about fencing around that pool? You know, these are all potential liability issues that could cause injury to the renter, which ultimately creates liability for the property owner. And, you know, worst case scenario, it falls back upon the township if there is a catastrophic injury and you know, they're looking for the deepest set of pockets, and that could very well be ACW Township.
It's a valid point. Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, so, oh, Ian?
Does it make any difference if it's short-term rental or just a regular Joe Blow?
No. It doesn't, but it,
None whatsoever.
Well, to me, I think it might, because there's a word, and of course I only saw it on TV, so maybe it's not a word, due diligence. If you live in a house and you choose not to put in a CO2 detector, who are you really suing? Yourself, right? But if you're renting it to someone else and I'm aware of it and I'm not saying it right, I mean, my husband likes to go on realtor.com and see what's for sale, and he shows them to me as if I'm interested. And this week it was billed as, you know, perfect for a short-term rental property. So we're aware of it, right? But we're not checking to see that it's safe. And I think that's where the liability trail will follow. That's my comment. Thank you.
As a short-term rent person,
Mhm.
I'm far more aware of that than I probably am for my own cottage. Just because I regulate the people, or we regulate the people who are renting it, but we're not there to watch them. Where our families there, we can control them. We think we can control them.
Mhm.
So as a short-term rent person, I think we're far more cautious on the rental cottage than what we are in our own cottage, as far as railings and everything else, smoke detectors, so forth.
Yeah, and I think that. Sorry, I think that's a very valid point, because I am responsible, I'm a director of a charity, owns ones as well. And we are very careful. We have Georgian Bay Fire something from Owen Sound come and inspect it every year. But unfortunately, it's not the responsible ones that are driving this issue. And we have to protect ACW for all of us, I think. Anita, did you have a comment?
A comment. So the noise and the open air burning bylaws, you know, definitely have, you know, deep concerns for particularly the immediate neighbors. But the one, going back to property standards, the one that kind of sort of sticks in me all the time is the septic issues, because there are a lot of implications, long-term implications that can happen with septic issues. And just property standards in general. You know, if you start to get renters in that, or, you know, even long-term renters in that don't adhere to, you know, taking out the trash regularly and so on, and then you start to get rodent problems, and that spreads, you know, to the neighbors. And those are long-term issues as well as the septic issues. But I guess the long and short of my point is that the complaints that I've heard over the last 2 to 3 years from people that are gravely affected by short-term renters that are not responsible, as Mr. Mayor had said, and reckless of the bylaws, is that it's the people that pay taxes in our township that we're serving here. And I sometimes feel as though we're putting them second to the people that are, you know, renting for a weekend and having fireworks and fires on the beach and trash strewn all over the place. And we're letting that override the rights of our taxpayers who support this township, who pay my wage as a counselor and who I represent. I feel as though I'm making them a second class in this whole thing. And really, they should be front and center, I believe.
Well, thank you for those comments, Anita. And I think by forming this committee and volunteers coming in, that we're showing them that we hear, we see, and we do value our property owners. Florence, did you have something to say before I go to you, Sean?
I was just gonna, something that Mike said that kind of triggered this is that in all essence of it, a licensing bylaw is very similar to having a driver's license. You have a driver's license, which gives you a privilege to drive on the road, and you have to follow the rules of that roadway and follow them all the time. And if you don't, you lose that privilege. And, you know, renting out an STR, however that gets defined, has, you know, as a result of the issues that have been brought up over the last couple of years, is becoming something that, you know, and for lack of a better word, it's becoming a privilege that needs to be monitored so that it can be run smoothly. You know, any regulation, any license is going to ensure that the rules are being followed. So you have to set what those rules are. So the job of this committee is to go through the rules, decide which rules are pertinent to a short-term rental, list those rules, and then from there, that's where you have your, well, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. So just to kind of weed it back into the purpose of the committee is to make sure that we establish that.
Thank you, Sean.
That was a perfect segue into what I was going to say. So great job chairing the meeting. Someone had mentioned demerit points before, and I think it was Florence. And I think that really needs to be the part that drives this is that for the one-time renter, the fee or the fine isn't going to be that big of a showstopper. But for the owner, if they're on a demerit point system and they hit whatever the maximum is, they can't operate their short-term rental, or there's a large financial fine associated with that, they're going to have more of an interest in regulating their users. And, you know, it may not be great for those good short-term rental operators, but for the ones that are maybe absentee and don't put as much care into it, I think that's one of the only ways that we're going to go through it or get through to them. And I think in that monitoring program that there was one of those options for the complaint process that included taking video and audio evidence and being able to submit it. So.
Okay, any further discussion? We're all on the same page here? Glenn?
Yeah, thanks very much. And Sean's comment just twigged something. So is it something we could possibly consider down the road as far as the consequences of not following the rules? And by that, I mean substantial fines. And you speak about demerit points, that sort of thing. That's just something in the back of my mind that I wonder if we could contemplate at a point in time.
Anita?
Well, and I like your idea, and sort of in the back of my mind, and I don't know how fines work, but if we went down that road, and that's a discussion a long way down the road, but what would your thoughts be on tying that fine to their taxes to ensure that you are able to collect the fine? Because just as Florence compared, you know, as a driver's license, we know that we've heard stories, people have a driver's license, they have so many demerit points, they lose their license, but they continue to drive without a license. And it concerns me that if we had short-term rentals, and this was the direction that this committee set for council to follow, that what happens if we have a short-term rental that has so many demerit points and heavy fines, not paid, but continue to operate? But they have to pay their taxes.
Sorry, I'm raising my own hand. Yes, you may speak. Not used to sitting here. Quite enjoy it though, Glenn. Look out. No, I'm kidding. Don't like it that much. I like aspects of both of what you said, but I don't actually necessarily agree with it all. What alarmed me more is when you said hefty fines. I agree there should be regulation, but again, I also am responsible for a short-term rental, and in the story I like to use is that Highway 21 is 80 kilometers an hour. There's a reason for that, the winter, the farmers, but certain times of the year, you can drive 100 safely. This is my opinion. If I choose to drive 100 safely and the OPP catch me, it doesn't really matter what I think, does it? I will get a penalty, and if I'm going 120, it's going to be bigger, which I don't. I should like to make that clear. And your demerit points get up. And then if you get enough demerit points, then you're called and you have to drive to Kitchener, not that it was me personally, and it defend your license. And then if you're habitual, then you get, we're not talking the breathalyzer here. This is horrendous. I mean, if he sets the neighbor's place on fire, maybe, but we're talking about small things that just keep adding up, right? So when I think about whether there should be fines, I do, but I also think they should be based on what it was and how many times, and repeat offenders are treated differently. And I'm not sure that, I think surely there would be a mechanism if we have the guy with the breathalyzer who gets his wife to blow on it or something, but I think there's more out there that would be the small repeat offenders that are really annoying to everyone around them, rather than the one explosive party that never happens again. Florence?
From a practical standpoint, the Municipal Act does allow municipalities some flexibility in terms of what they can charge to people's taxes. So I think that's something that we can look into, because that's a common practice for a lot of what the business at the municipalities do. We will be looking at, starting in January, samples of short-term rental bylaws, and all of these little nuances that we're kind of discussing today. We'll see that and what it's going to look like in a fruitful, platform. To that end, it's my understanding that if a municipality licenses their short-term rentals, if they don't have a license, they are not able to advertise on most platforms. So without a license, so if the municipality revokes the license, be it the fines or whatnot, they don't have an ability to advertise their business in the way that they would should they have a license. So it changes the game from an owner's perspective in how they operate if they choose to not license, or they choose to kind of, stay under the radar kind of thing. So I guess it all depends on how they choose to run their business as well.
Yep. Mike?
I agree with Florence's comments that license is critical to being able to advertise, but we should also keep in mind, based on the results of our survey, 56% of those that actually responded and were involved in the short-term rental game, they rent by referral and to families. So the licensing really doesn't impact that at all. So there's always that angle.
So to that end, and we'll also see that in another, and this, I'm garnishing some conversation here. The committee will also have to, at some point, define what a short-term rental is in terms of length of stay. I mean, if you have a neighbor who knows that that's renting out a short-term rental but can't find them advertising, they still qualify as a short-term rental because they're still renting it out. So they'll still have to, then they will have to apply for a license. So then it becomes a complaint-driven, neighbors watching neighbors kind of thing.
Nita?
That's exactly what I was thinking when Mike spoke up. Like, so if you rent out your short-term rental to the same folks year after year, you never have to advertise. How lucky are you that you don't have to advertise? My assumption is that it's still a short-term rental and it would still require a license. I just wanted to make sure that everyone agrees with, or I'm on the same page as everyone else with that assumption.
Ian?
We have our cottage rented out for 4 months of the year, short term, 1 week, 2 weeks. Off shoulder seasons, we rent it for 3 to 4 days. We do not advertise on any platform whatsoever. It's all done through our daughter's connections and family connections. And I agree, it is a short-term rental. And if there's going to be if we're going to keep track of who is doing short-term rentals, then it should be included in that. But we'll probably never put it on a platform. But with people like us doing it. And people have been doing it for a while. There's no merit to having a number saying there's 200 short-term rentals if you're not going to include those people. So I think they do have to be included. But unfortunately, like this, probably people like what we're doing, we don't have complaints. But we're going to be penalized because we're going to be paying the same fees and going through this. And I think we'll probably go, what we come up with will be below what we do as far as maintenance and everything else is health, the safety. So
Florence, did you want to add to that?
I was just gonna comment that the purpose of the regulation has a few different elements, facets to it. One of them is the safety and integrity of the short-term rental for the renters, right? And having that license in place, regardless of how you advertise it, is integral in making sure that the place is a safe place to rent. Having the inspections done, that's all part of that licensing program process to get the license.
Glenn?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I'm really glad you brought that up, Ian. So I just like your perspective. And, if you do rent out or other people use your cottage for periods of time, it's not up to us to inspect the commerce, whether a person charges or whether you don't, that's not our purview. My question is, with your situation that you brought forward, would you have any issue if you were licensed or required to be licensed?
no, but we wouldn't. It's a good idea to be able to get that number for the township so they know what they're dealing with. And I think from what I've read in the questionnaires and that, there's a handful of complaints. So we're putting a lot of work into it for a very small group, which is okay because it's got to be done because we're all painted with the same brush, whether you're guilty or not.
Mary?
I think it's important to recognize that people who own short-term rentals are taxpayers too. And, have their rights need to be respected. And I think, what Mike mentioned, the importance of education. And I think that's probably key is that, tenants need to know the expectations when they arrive. And the people that are renting the short-term rentals need to know those expectations too, and to share that. But people have been doing short-term rentals in this community as long as there's been, a tent to pitch or a cabin to, and I hope that that's going to be able to continue in a safe way. So.
Thank you for those comments. Florence, I'm going to ask you, because I'll just ask you next month, so I'm going to ask you now. When you bring forward the examples from other municipalities of their short-term rental bylaws, will you be bringing forward with how long they've been in place and if they think they're working?
Yes, I will.
I thought you might.
So we have reached out to the other municipalities and asked them, a few general questions about how their bylaws are going and how they have seen things happen. And for the most part, from a staff's perspective, it's been very positive. In curbing the issues that they deal with regularly. So next meeting, we will bring that back, the comments. They're fairly brief. It was a short little survey and everybody just wonderfully took the time to respond to me, which is great. But we'll bring that back we'll start with two bylaws and then go from there.
Further question? Go right ahead. Thank you. Often when we get reports from staff on council, there would be recommendations attached. Is that something you will be doing? No. And that's, any answer
Yeah.
is okay.
So in the role of the committee, it is the committee's job to make those recommendations. It's not staff's job to do that. We'll happily bring you forward the information you ask. However, the reviewing the issues and making sure that it's in the interest of the municipality, that's what the committee was appointed to do. So,
Thank you. Any further questions before we move on? We're all happy with what we've learned, what we've shared. Does anybody want to sing Kumbaya? No. Okay, then. Moving on to item number 5, new business. Does anyone have any new business for our clerk to bring forward? No? Seeing none? We'll move on. The next meeting is scheduled for January 28th, 2025 at 7 p.m. or at the call of the chair. Can I have a motion for adjournment? I already called on you, Ian. Can't call on you. Sean and Mike. That the short-term rental committee does now adjourn to meet again on January 28th, 2025 at 7 p.m. or at the call of the chair. All in favor of that motion? Motion is carried. Thank you all, and I look forward to a wonderful Christmas, and we'll see you in January.